Well, good afternoon and good morning for some folks, depending upon where you are. Thanks so much for all the early birds jumping in and logging in early. I'm John Manna. We're going to kick things off in just a minute or two, but we're going to be delivering a session. We've got several speakers. I'll introduce you to those folks in a second. But if you have questions during the session, there's a Q&A panel on the right side, so maybe take a look and get familiar with that. Please ask your questions right there in that panel. We may be able to answer them right in flight, right, as we're talking about that particular topic, or we may batch some towards the end. If we don't get to your question, we will absolutely look to follow up with you after the session and make sure you get the answer you need. Hey, the other thing I'm excited about, number 2 on this slide, is this session is eligible for CPE credit. It's the first time one of these workshops has been eligible for that, so we're excited to do that. If you're a professional in a space where you can get CPE credit for a session like today, there are some rules around it. The most important one is there's going to be 3 poll questions that come up throughout the session. Just answer those poll questions, and officially, that's all you need to do. If you have any challenges or trouble with the poll technology or coming up on your screen, just mention it to us in chat, just so we can check you off unofficially and make sure you get your credit by the end of the week. And as a reminder, this is part of CDW's monthly educational workshop series. Some of you have been to many of our others, but we do it once a month. It's tied to ServiceNow, but like today's session, some of it is product agnostic, meaning we're going to talk a lot about process and policies and best practices, and the actual technology that we're going to refer to is actually secondary. And you'll see that a little bit more today. But if you're interested in making sure you're invited to other sessions, let us know. The next one coming up is what's new in Utah release. And last thing for housekeeping, if any of you are heading to ServiceNow's Knowledge event in Vegas this May, please let us know. We've got a huge customer appreciation event and some other opportunities for you to meet with some consultants on the topics that you're interested in. So that's really the housekeeping. So let's go ahead and get rolling. Let me introduce to you who we're going to have today contributing. I won't kind of read through their backgrounds, but it's here in a deck as a takeaway for you. By the way, you'll get a copy of the deck and a recording and some other stuff at the end of the day today. We've got Chris Gordon, who's part of our ServiceNow practice here, but he is a security expert, and you'll hear him and see him lead some of the more visual components of what we're going to talk about today. Clay is going to kind of get us to the heart of the best practices elements, and you'll hear Larry Burke kick us off with some things, and Donnell will be providing some commentary and some follow-up help along the way. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to Larry to get us kicked off. Larry, you are up.
Thank you very much, John, for that kind introduction and setting the stage for what I think is going to be an exciting hour or so with everybody. So first off, and I think everyone has probably heard that quote before, that the world's most valuable resource is not oil, but data. And we know that companies continue to evolve and become technology companies, even though they may not view themselves as technology companies because of digitalization and how quickly technology is changing industries. And with this change, really surfaces risks that we didn't have to think about 20, 30, 40, even 10 years ago. And one way that organizations are really starting to get their arms around this is through integrated risk management. And what is integrated risk management? Well, if we go to our next slide, we'll see that integrated risk management really is a term coined by Gartner, but since we have ChatGPT available, I thought I'd also ask ChatGPT, what is the definition of integrated risk management? And what that means is that today organizations really look to integrate their practices around risks as part of a greater strategic alignment, understanding where the risks are, and then how they respond to those risks, often through policies and controls and monitoring of those risks, thinking about the integration of people, process, and technology. This, as organizations continue to grow and get more complicated, really need to have the ability to manage and report on risks, really as a result of different stakeholders pressuring organizations today to be able to tell them where they stand as it relates to their risk and response. And if we go to our next slide, I want to highlight a few drivers And there's many, I think, as everybody in practice knows today. But two, I wanted to just highlight for purposes of today. One is really the corporate governance expectations and litigation as a result of that. And I referenced two very prominent cases in the Delaware courts that really established the duty of care. And what that means is that boards of directors really have an obligation to oversee how organizations manage cybersecurity, governance, risk, and compliance. The other driver of this is the regulatory environment that we're in. And there are a lot of different regs. And you can probably have an alphabet soup 3 times over of all the regulatory bodies that oversee organizations depending on their industry and their jurisdiction where they practice. This level of complexity between corporate governance and the regulatory environment really require organizations to demonstrate that they've got a mature IRM program in place. Now, how do they do that? First, let's understand a little bit about what each kind of driver is driving in terms of requirements for management and for the organizations themselves. So if we go to the next slide, and we talk a little bit about corporate governance drivers, actually the slide after this one. As we've talked about and what we've seen in court cases is that boards of directors really have to have the ability to demonstrate risk oversight around cybersecurity as an example. And what does that mean? That boards have the ability to get information based on the reporting systems that exist in organizations and that they monitor those reports. And so quite simply stated, we know that organizations today need to have policies in place, need to have controls in place to protect the data, and they need to make sure that those controls are operating effectively, designed and operating effectively. And this process needs to be reported up to boards. Oftentimes you're seeing CISOs report on at least an annual basis. You're also seeing external auditors report to boards about the audit process and if there's any issues with the internal controls around technology. So that's one driver. So the expectation and what we're seeing is that boards are becoming more involved in overseeing risk, in particular cybersecurity risk. I was on an audit committee call a little bit earlier today discussing the state of what audit committees think is the single biggest risk in 2023, and the number one risk was cybersecurity. So we've got boards and we've got governance. Another driver, if we go to the next slide, is what I describe as the next slide after this one, is kind of the alphabet soup of the federal and state privacy statutes. You've got everything from the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which has resulted in some very large initial court rulings, hundreds of millions of dollars, to ongoing HIPAA compliance and high-tech challenges, to what I want to talk about today with a thought towards what I think is going to be put in place starting in April, and that's the SEC cybersecurity disclosure rules. Even though you might be a private company, you're going to be influenced by these SEC cybersecurity disclosure rules. So I wanted to spend a few minutes today just walking through some of the rules that we expect to be finalized in April. So if we go to our next slide. And the SEC has taken the position that companies need to disclose to their investors certain information, with the thought being that the more they disclose, the more accountable management is going to be to protect the companies on behalf of shareholders or stockholders. So there's a couple of things that are going to become required explicitly, we think, next month. These are proposed rules. There's no indication that there's going to be large deviations from the proposed rules to what is going to be finalized. So here's the proposed rules as they stand today. We expect them to be finalized with implementation sometime in the near future. All organizations need to have a risk assessment program if you have one. Most organizations do have some type of risk assessment program. Under an IRM program, risk assessment is really where you start. And so you're going to have to describe that program to your investors. So the presumption is you're going to have that in place. So that's going to be a catalyst for organizations to start to put these things in place. And we've seen there's a maturity where companies start doing a risk assessment, and as they become larger and more complicated, they may engage with consultants or assessors or other third parties as part of that overall program. We want to be able to describe that requirement too to investors. And we also recognize that policies are required to oversee and set standards within the organization, especially around third-party risk, if there's personal information involved. All of these types of disclosures assume that programs are in place by the organization. And the best way to report cohesively is using an IRM program and using some of the IRM tools that exist out there, including what we're going to talk about today. We're going to see a little bit of a demonstration on that. If we go to the next slide, here's some additional things you've got to think about. If you happen to have an incident, you want to talk about activities to minimize that risk. And if you do have an incident, you want to talk about what your business continuity and disaster recovery plans are if there is an incident. And if you have had an incident, how has that changed your approach? Now, incidents are often occurring throughout an organization. A lot of companies use a SIM tool to centralize and standardize that, but the reporting around that process is really a function of the maturity of your IRM program. If we go to our next slide. The other thing that we need to talk about is our board's cybersecurity expertise. So remember, we talked about boards providing oversight around management, understanding what's happening from a cybersecurity perspective. But we also need to describe what our boards do to oversee that. And are there experts on the board level? And then marrying up the board's oversight, what management does, and how those cybersecurity risks could impact that organization is an ongoing process. Organizations change, risks change. It's a dynamic environment that we're in. A mature cybersecurity program will allow companies to be able to report on this. And oftentimes we've seen less mature companies will have a lot of spreadsheets, there's a lot of stakeholders, it's a very unorganized process. Mature IRM programs using automated solutions like what we're going to see today will help streamline that. And candidly, what we believe is that the manual processes are going to very quickly migrate to an automated process because of the necessary requirements to report. So we're going to talk a little bit about more in terms of what an IRM program looks like, and it's a journey. If we go to our next slide, keep in mind that not every organization started out of the gate at the most mature. It's a kind of a crawl, walk, run approach. And Clay is going to share with us a little bit about how companies start on that journey and where they end up and what's possible today in terms of tool sets and the tooling that ServiceNow brings. Go ahead, Clay.
Thanks, Larry. So yeah, this is a good opportunity to take a step back and look at a couple of key building blocks within an IRM program as it relates to maturing and scaling up. So what we're showing here is a pretty straightforward, high-level IRM maturity scale. It shows the major milestones that organizations would have implemented as they progress from, say, the level 1 initial stage all the way to the level 5 optimizing stage. So let's focus on what's highlighted there at 2 and 3 in the red boxes. Many organizations currently reside somewhere between 2 and 3, possibly lean more towards level 2. So if assuming that's true, they might have a risk register and they might have control catalog loosely defined. But if the idea is really to mature and grow, then aligning your framework components to give you a proactive output is a critical building block on the pathway to IRM maturity. And it supports a well-built information security program, by the way. So let's pause here and take the opportunity to answer our first poll question. So you should see this pop up on your screen and perhaps off to the side. So where does your organization fit along the maturity scale? So are you a level 1 initial, a level 2 developing, level 3 defined? Maybe you're a level 4 where you've got some things managed, and if you're lucky, you're a level 5 and you're doing everything great. So we will leave this on screen here for a few seconds and let you guys answer this. And just a quick reminder, if you are wanting to receive CPE for today's webinar, you do need to answer these poll questions. And if you don't know the answer to this poll question, that's okay. Take your best stab at it. Maybe by the end of today's call, you'll have a better idea of it. In a brief moment here, we'll transition to the next slide. We'll be looking a little bit at what the IRM pain points might be. So I'll give you another moment to answer. We've taken a look at the results of what a growing IRM maturity program, mature program might look like, but what are the pain points along the way? An organization at the developing stage might find itself overwhelmed with the amount and redundancy of risk assessments. They probably have some components in place, but they're probably disjointed and not integrated. Does this sound familiar? So why does this happen? Well, it's typically because risk management is approached in an ad hoc, redundant way. So you might find that resources are testing the same control multiple times for different assessments across multiple frameworks and regulations. And as previously mentioned, companies may have defined their risks and controls, but they're likely siloed and disjointed. They probably live in different systems like email or PowerPoint, perhaps spreadsheets if you're lucky. This makes complying with multiple regulations and standards such as NIST, CSF, PCI, SOX, so on, very difficult. Additionally, monitoring and reporting is probably disparate and inconsistent. So touching back on what Larry said, this can lead to a lack of assurance, really, that the company will achieve its objectives. So how do you know what your risk profile really is? This is a common question for an organization that is starting to mature their IRM program. So really, how do we consolidate these efforts? And let's just take a look real quick at the poll. I see, I actually can't see the results yet, but we'll get those to you. So let's take a look at.
Sorry, Clay, I've got those for you.
Yeah.
I've got to open on a bigger screen here. So listen, we got 11% said they're at level 1. We have 46% at level 2. And 37% at level 3. So between level 2 and level 3, between those two, we had 83%, with 3% at level 4 and 3% at level 5.
Wow, that's about what I expected. That's interesting. So I think that shows a good cross-sectional view of where a lot of folks are at. So thank you, John. Appreciate that. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about our control framework. So if we look at our controls, typically they're scattered or perhaps missing. A lot of times we see duplicated controls and control gaps may be present. Risks may be defined, but they haven't been mapped to our controls yet. And so here's some steps to remediate some of these issues. So first, define and document your control framework. Say it's NIST CSF or PCI, what have you. Then map these controls to the applicable regulatory frameworks such as NYDFS, SOX, or HIPAA, whatever you have to abide by. And then really at the end, there should be a one-to-many relationship here. So next, perform an assessment of your controls to identify where gaps may exist, such as a regulatory requirement or a policy missing a mitigating control. Look for duplicated controls and consolidate. Ensure controls are not too vague, but are indeed, prescriptive and appropriate for whatever requirement they are addressing. And really, they need to provide reasonable assurance. I'm going to hit on this again, that the organization can achieve its objectives. So finally, map the controls. Once you've done all this, map your controls and policy and risks to your policies. If you can't do this all in Excel, rule of thumb, then chances are you probably overcomplicated it. So, all right, our next poll question here. So here, as we think about our controls, ask yourself, how many regulatory frameworks do you need to align with? So, SOX, NYDFS, HIPAA, GDPR, the list goes on and on. Is it 0, 1, 2, or 3, maybe all of them? Again, we'll leave this up for a moment here, and just another reminder to answer these poll questions so that you do receive your CPE credit. And then in a moment here, we're going to be talking a little bit about maturing your risk assessment framework. Okay, so let's address your risk assessment framework. So do you have, first of all, a top-down support? So in other words, is your governance defined and in place? Does everyone know their seats on the bus, or are your roles and responsibilities shared and implied across your different areas? It's something you definitely want to address. So next, are your assessments integrated? So do they tie together the main risk management program areas like technology risk and cyber risk, ops, operational risk, and enterprise or strategic risk? And again, do the controls provide assurance that the company is able to meet their objectives? Are your top strategic risks defined, and is leadership being made aware of their disposition? And then finally, integrate the inputs and outputs of your program and a tool to improve efficiency. So gone are the days of redundant and repetitive tasks, the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. You really want to free up your team to do what they do best, staying ahead of threats and risks and further developing a risk-aware culture. So we're going to, as Larry mentioned earlier, we're going to be taking a look how this could work in an IRM solution platform, and we're actually going to be looking at it from a vantage point of an access management theme. So we'll take a look at that here in a moment.
Hey Clay, got the results for you on the last one.
Awesome.
Yep. So we had 8% gave the answer B, which is 1. We had 42% give the answer C, which is 2 or 3, and we had 50% select D, which was all of them.
Yeah, that's daunting. I know. It's a lot. So again, it points back to that need to really make sure that these things are tied together and they're mapped together. Otherwise, it's going to get out of control pretty quickly. All right, so I've moved into key risk indicators here. So let's just take a pause. If you've taken care of everything up to this point, done a good job of putting in the effort to align your risk assessments, get your control crosswalks set up, you can start looking for ways to spot red flags. So you really want to know about threats before they happen. So you want to be able to respond to these threats by putting measures in place early on. That's where we want to get to. So key risk indicators offer this kind of real-time visibility on your top risks, and they should support your defined risk framework. So here on screen, we have an example of a KRI around access management. In the first KRI there towards the bottom, 1.7, we're getting awfully close to hitting our target threshold of DBAs with privileged access. Whereas the next KRI is sitting decently below our target. If you were to aggregate these all up with other KRIs, you could have a holistic view of your top risks and where they stand versus the threshold. So this can be valuable intel for leadership when deciding where to invest resources. So we've had a sneak peek at what a KRI dashboard looks like, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, dashboarding, reporting is where we make all this great data come to life and tell the story that our leadership really wants to know, which is, what's my risk profile? So thinking back to our control crosswalks and risk assessments, are my controls effective? So, what risks are we currently dealing with, and are they being addressed? What policies, regulations, and frameworks are we compliant with? And as we've mentioned with KRIs, are we approaching a risk tolerance threshold? Do we need to act fast so that we hit our objectives and execute on our opportunities? Okay, so now back to that tool that we mentioned earlier. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Chris Gordon, Chris is a ServiceNow GRC IRM expert. He's going to take you much deeper into that use case, access management use case that I mentioned, and show you how you can manage this in a tool. So Chris?
So before we get into kind of a live demo, we're going to go into another poll question. John Manna, did you want to go through this one?
Yep, I got it, Chris. Thanks. So as mentioned here, we've got one more poll question. If you can take a look at that and answer it. And by the way, a few of you have messaged us that you haven't been able to click in time or had trouble getting it in. We got you noted on that. Don't worry about it. But yeah, this is the last question, and it really is about ServiceNow itself. So if you currently are considering ServiceNow's IRM stack, please pick A. If you've already got it implemented, B. If you use ServiceNow but really are not considering it right now for IRM, there's C. And if you're not even a ServiceNow user, that'll be D. So thanks a bunch for taking a moment there. We'll leave it up just another second or two. But Chris, I think you're good to head on and continue with the tour.
All right. So what I'm going to do with you next here is walk through kind of a guided tour using a summarized snapshot of what we're seeing in ServiceNow integrated risk management. And this is on the latest, greatest release of ServiceNow on the Utah release. So some of the new features that just recently came out, I'm going to highlight a few of those. What we're looking at here is called the compliance workspace. And, you know, part of the newer release of ServiceNow coming out last year and this year is these new user interfaces called workspaces. It's part of the ServiceNow program called Next Experience. And what they're trying to do is give you an enhanced view so that everyone participating in the process has the same landing page, the same user experience. And so in this, we can see we're logged in as my good buddy Josh Zombie, who is in a great band. And what we're seeing here on the compliance management homepage is an overview snapshot dashboard. And on the right side, a button to create new records like policies, controls, or issues. Below that, you know, what's assigned to me and what's assigned to the teams that I'm part of. So consistently, anyone logging in here that's got a homework assignment under tasks, I can see my pending tasks or my group's tasks. And then under the blue bar on the left side of the screen, there's additional navigation. So for this user access management use case, what I'm going to start with is going into my list view here and look for my policies that I'm in charge of. So I've got a couple of policies, third-party vendor risk policy and an enterprise user access management policy. I can also see the state that one is draft, one is published, and I'm going to go into my enterprise user access management policy. So in my policy here, we can see at the top of the record, it's currently published. The type of record we're looking at is a policy. It could be a standard procedure or other documentation for your compliance program. We have a valid to date. And what I'm looking at here is the control objectives tab. What we're seeing here is in order to make this policy compliant to our organization, I have 5 control objectives that I'm going to build a library of controls around. You can see they cover many different cybersecurity frameworks like ISO 27001, CIS Top 20, PCI, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and Sarbanes-Oxley. One of the questions we get from our customers all the time when we're demoing and solutioning for them is it possible for us to implement one control that satisfies many frameworks? And the answer is yes. Now with the latest release of ServiceNow Utah, ServiceNow has given us a new function and feature that can do that, and I'll show you that in a moment. So if we were to select one of these, which one of these control frameworks or control domains would be the one that we would want to say is our super control? And in this case, I'll pick on the NIST cybersecurity framework. That's one of the more popular frameworks that we implement for customers. So I'm going to drill into the control record associated to that policy for the NIST CSF PR AC4, where access permissions and authorizations are managed. We can see some information in this new experience. If you were used to the ServiceNow console, this is the new version of what the record looks like from that compliance workspace. We see that We have a status of compliant where we've attested the control once and attached evidence to prove the control is compliant. And there's a new status here called function, and it says standard control. If you look at the top middle there, we have a function called standard control. So all new controls being created in ServiceNow IRM from the Utah release will have this function field. All new controls will start as a standard function. What I want to say is this NIST control is the kind of governing control or super control that's going to satisfy those other cybersecurity frameworks so that I don't have to attach evidence, and keep certifying those other framework controls because they're all very similarly related. So what I'm going to do is kind of upgrade this control from standard control to what ServiceNow calls a common control. If you look in the top right where our buttons are, next to 360-degree view, there's a ... icon that's called more options, and there's a convert to common action that I can take there. I'm going to convert this to a common control. It's going to ask me, do I want to convert it to a common control? It'll allow me to add what are called reliant entities, which is this new feature that we're going to see. So I'll hit OK. And if we look in the middle of this control record, we have different tabs here above that kind of blue message. And you'll see new tabs here called reliant entity types and reliant entities. So you've got kind of two options for saying, if this is my super control, what are the controls that I'm governing over? So on the reliant entity tab, you can select an entity type with one or multiple control objectives that have controls associated to it, and say that we're governing this entity type with these controls underneath it, and that will inherit the compliance score from the governing common control that we're using here today. The second option is to go to the Reliant Entities tab, and you have the option here where you can hit the Add button and select different individual entities with associated controls, or hit Add from Existing Control, and it'll pull up different controls associated to those entities that I can relate directly to this common control. One thing to note is where you may have attested and attached evidence, historically in those other standard controls that we're now making reliant to the common control, what ServiceNow says is we don't need these controls to live and breathe anymore. We can retire them. So ServiceNow will take an action to retire those standard controls that are directly linked as reliant entities to the common control. So a better way to look at this, if you were going to share this with a leader or an auditor or compliance officer, is again part of that new experience that ServiceNow has built for us in these cool new workspaces. If we look at the buttons on the top right, there's a button called 360-degree view. This came out last year as part of the compliance workspace kind of user experience. So if we click on that 360-degree view, here's what we see. It's a visual oriented kind of one-stop shop to see related to this control, what's upstream from it for control objectives, what's downstream from it if there's downstream citations or controls underneath it. To the left, applies to shows me that it's directly associated to one entity, but has governing ability over 3 reliant entities. Where I click that reliant entities, it shows on a panel on the right side what those 3 entities are. There's also a control test plan that's been associated to this control. And on the right where it says included, think of that as anything that's been actionable against it. So we've had 1 attestation, we've submitted 1 control test, and we have 1 open issue. Other things you might see in there are evidence requests or things like that. So what I want to do next is go from the control, and here's our common control. And what I want to do is link that into a risk. The idea here is in the integrated risk management universe, we want to show that we go from policy to control, control to risk, and then back to the policy as a never-ending cycle. So one thing I do recommend is if you are going to use this new feature for common controls, one thing I'd highly recommend as a must-have is that you should always have at least one risk directly associated to any control that you upgrade to a common control. So in this 360-degree view, I kind of skipped ahead here. I created a new risk record, associated it to the control, and on the applies to, now I can see that there's an associated risk. So I'm going to drill into that risk record. And first, I'm going to navigate over to the risk management workspace. Again, similar to the compliance workspace, it's part of that new user experience, and it has its own landing page for risk management. Has a very similar look and feel, very consistent to the compliance workspace, the audit workspace, the vendor risk management workspace, privacy management workspace, all have very similar landing pages. Again, in the middle, we've got overview showing our highest risks, net loss to date, key risk indicator failures, and other information below it in a chart. To the right, we have tasks, what's assigned to me or what's assigned to my teams, and a create button where I can establish new risks, controls, or issues. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the blue bar there. The blue bar gives us additional navigation, and I'm going to go to the bottom link there and look for my associated risk. I'm going to pull up my risk record that's directly associated to that common control, and it's called unauthorized access to systems. And if we look in the description, the risk scenario is describing where we have unauthorized user access that leads to something that's going to degrade the business. Some kind of business risk is occurring based on this risk scenario. So what we want to do is say where we have this common governing control, what's the risk to our organization if that control becomes unstable or isn't properly implemented, and how do we mitigate that or how do we attack that? So here's our risk record. The first thing I want to do with this risk record that I've related to my control is hit the assess button. We're going to do kind of a three-part assessment. Step one, I'm going to kick the assessment off. That's going to show up in the form of a questionnaire. So you can either develop your own questionnaire for a risk assessment, use the out-of-the-box one, which most customers don't really like, to be honest, or if you have the professional or enterprise license of ServiceNow, you could take advantage of the NIST CSF plugin that has NIST risk management framework questionnaires tied to each control domain of NIST. In this case, the identity authorization access management category of NIST has its own question for risk assessment in here, and that's what we're looking at here. So I'm going to fill out those responses ranging between very low and very high. From a residual risk standpoint, with what we have in place today, are we at low, moderate, high, or very high? I'll fill out these responses and hit submit. Out of the box, it doesn't actually quantify and calculate the risk. There's an advanced risk product in enterprise risk or enterprise IRM that lets you do more quantified risk assessment based on questions, but this is kind of the basic risk assessment. So we're back at our risk record. The second step of my risk assessment is to go to the controls tab of the risk and either add controls that are directly associated to this unauthorized access to systems and see how compliant they are. So I want to see how effective my controls are that we do have in place today. So again, I have 5 controls associated with this risk. You may recognize them from the policy that we started at. The NIST control, CIS top 20, ISO 27K, and so on are all directly related to this risk. We can see on the status column on the far right that those controls are currently all compliant, which means that's really good. But in the integrated risk management universe, we really want everything working in lockstep. So things outside the risk owner's purview of the risk record could be occurring that the risk owner should really be notified of. So one thing I do recommend is if you do set up common controls and you set up at least one risk associated to the common control, another thing I highly recommend you set up is something called an indicator. The key risk indicators are a way to see how effective our program is where everything is working together. So if we look on this record. There's an indicator tab. I'm going to navigate over to that indicator tab and see that I have a new indicator set up here called Unauthorized Access Incident Reported. The idea is where we are detecting unauthorized user access issues, we're going to report them through the service desk in the form of an incident. When those incidents are recorded, our indicator is going to run on a schedule, and in an automated fashion, it's going to see in the last reporting period from the time the previous indicator ran to this one, do we have any new detected unauthorized user access incidents? And if so, then I want to alert the risk owner that this occurred. So I'm going to go into my indicator and run that indicator. So here's my indicator. And what will happen is when I hit the execute button, I can ad hoc kick off that indicator to run, or it'll run on a schedule. You can see on the top of the record, it says the collection frequency is daily. So I can have this indicator run every day and do a homework assignment to see if we're detecting new incidents of user unauthorized access entry. So we can see the previous results. Every time the indicator runs, it creates a result. You can see the last 3 times it ran, it failed. So it's designed to detect the non-compliance of an unauthorized access entry. So I'm going to go into the latest version of that indicator result, and I can see at the top here, failed. So that tells me it detected something. On the right side, I can hit view supporting data, and that's going to pull up the actual data it found in ServiceNow by itself. Again, no human intervention. This ran in an automated fashion and is doing our continuous validation for us. So I'll click view supporting data, and in that pop-up window, I can see the service desk created 2 new incident records related to user unauthorized access. And that's what the indicator zapped in on and brought those records to the indicator result so that I can share that with whoever I need to. So from here, I go back to my risk record, and where that indicator failure runs, it generates a brand new issue and assigns that issue over to Josh Zombie, our risk manager of this risk, so that they are now aware that, hey, our indicator detected non-compliance and generate an issue to let you know as the risk owner that we're having a compliance problem. So where there's a compliance problem on the policy and control side of the house, the risk owner is also brought into that discussion. So we pull up the control tab, and where I was performing my risk assessment a moment ago, all of my controls were compliant. But if we look based on that indicator that ran that I kicked off, we look at the first control on the list here, it is non-compliant. These were all compliant a moment ago prior to the indicator running. So now we see we've got a non-compliant control that is triggered from that indicator. So that's going to weigh in my decision making now for my completing my risk assessment. I go to the details tab of my risk, go to the scoring tab. On the left side, we can see inherent impact, inherent likelihood. That's the rating of the risk. If there's nothing in place today to prevent this from happening, it would be very high impact and extremely likely in our organization if we had nothing in place. Now that I know we have 5 controls governed by 1 common control, and that common control is failed and is non-compliant, I'm going to set the residual score. What I was originally thinking was probably moderate or low, and I'm going to bump it up to high and likely because this is not good. We have an indicator failure that triggered the control to be non-compliant, and that's not going to fly with me. So we need to fix this. So I'm going to give the impact and likelihood a higher rating. And then under the response section, I can either accept the risk for the level of residual risk it's at, or mitigate it. In this case, I'm choosing to mitigate. So that gives me a better understanding when I do a risk assessment on how compliant and how effective our controls are, and set up those key risk indicators to monitor compliance and let the risk owner know what's going on. Go back to the risk dashboard on the console version of ServiceNow Risk, and we'll see we have a variety of different reporting that we can do dashboards around. In this case, we're looking at a residual risk dashboard, and then next to it is the inherent risk. So we would compare and contrast those inherent risks versus residual risks to see if we're lowering our risk posture down. From that new user experience in the compliance dashboard, same thing, we would see a risk profile overview in the risk workspace, where we'd see our highest risks, net losses year to date, key risk indicator failures, and our risk posture below that is the same or similar heat map where I can sort it and view it by inherent risks contrasted against residual risks. Now, to bring it back full circle, we go back to our policy that we started this journey with. The policy owner can be notified of that issue through the policy record. And we go to the policy record, we now see that the policy was 100% compliant. It's dropped down to 80% compliant because one of the controls is non-compliant. Happens to be the common control that's governing all the other ones as well. So that's not good. So down below here, we can see other things in the policy record. Again, part of the new compliance workspace user experience gives us more visual indicators inside each record. So we can see policy acknowledgements, policy exception requests, and I see now that I have 2 open issues directly associated back to my policy. So now the policy owner is aware that we have non-compliance around a control that was triggered from a risk assessment through a risk indicator. So all these things now start talking to one another, where you may have a different policy owner, control owner, or risk owner. They're all aware of the non-compliance to the issue of the control failure at the policy user level, at the control owner level, and the risk owner level. Brings it all together, and that's the integrated risk management experience that you would want to set up in ServiceNow, going from a lower maturity through spreadsheets and manual tracking to a more systematic approach where we're formalizing these processes, streamlining and making that user experience more consistent, and we're linking policies to controls, controls to risks, risks to indicators that are either control indicators or risk indicators. Other things like evidence requests, control testing are other sub-processes that can be tied to the program. So it's all wrapped together, and it's all part of this new user experience with the new compliance workspaces. So I'm done with my part. I want to hand it back over to Larry to kind of wrap things up.
Thank you, Chris. That was quite informative, and that was really one of the highest levels of maturity, I think, in terms of what you walk through and the capabilities that ServiceNow brings. So bringing it all together, we recognize that organizations vary in their maturity, and we've had our experience talking to organizations that are very spreadsheet centric and they want to go out and first go and get it to the level of maturity that we just saw with Chris. What we would suggest as you go through the process is recognize it's a journey, number one. Number two, make sure that you've got your inputs in place. So spreadsheets, policies, if they're disaggregated, you want to bring them into a organized fashion so that they can start to feed the ServiceNow information needs, policies, risks, controls, control owners, process owners. And then that reporting takes time and really takes an overall dedication by your board and by members of management to go ahead and start that journey to implement. If you look here, the way we think about it is you're going to go and prepare and get all your information ready to populate IRM module. And then as you get to a position where you can start to think about designing, configuring, and deploying, that becomes an optimized process. What Chris demonstrated was a very high level maturity of an organization, but you've got to start somewhere. And we know that the regulators and boards are expecting that you're able as an organization to report on these in a timely and in an efficient fashion. So as we wrap up today, I know there's a question, we'll get to it. But what I wanted to remind everybody, number one, from a CPE perspective, if you had problems, I know in the chat there were some issues with the questions, please reach out to us separately. We'll address that. We'll make sure you get your CPE certificate. Secondly, Chris's demo I thought was fantastic, and we're happy to have a one-off meeting with everybody if desired to walk you through the specifics and really get into the details around how you can start this journey, or if you're already on the platform, how you can continue to mature, because some of the new functionality that's coming down the pike, plus what Chris showed, is really going to highlight where I think organizations are going. And we look forward to addressing any questions. So please follow up with us. Chris, I don't know if you saw the question in the chat, but I thought it was an interesting question. I'm just going to read it out for those that may not see that. And the question relates to how were the incidents, the two incidents, input at the service desk and then found in the example? Is it because the service desk ticketing in ServiceNow? So the question revolves around how would those incidents get put into ServiceNow?
Yep. The example I used was an indicator that's looking right at the incident management table. And you can set up indicators to peruse and look at any data that's in ServiceNow. Could be data in the CMDB at your CI level. In this case, I did it at the process level. And I said, if there are certain categorized incidents that are categorized as unauthorized access, then that is what the indicator is going to go look for. So you can set up these automated indicators to go look for anything. The example I just set up were 2 mock incidents that I logged prior to the demo, and just they were logged through the service desk. But however you want to set up your filtering criteria, you can set up these indicators to be automated and look for data in ServiceNow. So to me, it's not hard to set those up. It only took me a couple minutes to set up. If you're curious to know how to do those, I'd be happy to meet with you privately, and show you how to do that fun stuff.
With that, Chris, I think we'll see if there's any other questions coming in on the chat. I don't see any. So we're almost at the top of the hour. So we appreciate everyone taking some time out today, learning a little bit more about what an IRM journey entails and what today the tools available with ServiceNow IRM can do for your organization. And we look forward to seeing you in the future at future monthly events like this or at the upcoming ServiceNow conferences. With that, I think we're ready to sign off. So I want to just send a thank you to our panelists, Chris and Clay, and then John for kicking us off. And now that it's in the afternoon and a lot of the part of the U.S., let's have the rest of the day and enjoy your lunch if you haven't, and enjoy your dinner. With that, we wish everyone a great rest of the day and great rest of the week.